Good morning, everyone. Can everyone hear me? Thank you. Thank you so much for being here. You could have been anywhere on this mountain right now, but you're here with us, and we appreciate that. I'm Lauren Pabst. I'm a Senior Program Officer for Journalism and Media at the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation. So welcome. This morning's conversation, Narrative Sovereignty Beyond Boundaries, is hosted in partnership with Cousin Collective and the Indigenous Program here at the Sundance Institute. In MacArthur's Journalism and Media program, we take an ecosystem approach to documentary by funding more than 20 organizations that support filmmakers working across an entire, essential, inspiring spectrum of nonfiction, from investigative reporting that uses the power of cinema to expose deeply rooted systems of harm, contribute to a more accurate and fact-based narrative, and inspire action to hold powerful interests accountable, to experimental films, which explore new forms and aesthetics beyond hegemonic systems of image making and colonial patterns of seeing, to reflect, uplift, challenge, reveal, or obscure, and all the forms of documentary film that exist within that spectrum. Everyone here understands the power of storytelling, but sometimes we forget about the storytelling of power, all the systems that maintain dominant narratives of exploitation, exclusion, and erasure. But what happens when the frame is radically altered and Indigenous communities are prioritized as storytellers and audiences through film and art? Today, we will hear a conversation between multidisciplinary artist Rhayne Vermette, the recipient of the 2025 Marata Mita Fellowship from the Sundance Indigenous Program, and Quinne Larsen, a Sundance Native Lab Fellow whose film, Field Recording, is screening in the short film program at the festival this year. MacArthur Fellow Jeffrey Gibson was supposed to join us today, but he is unable to due to travel issues, and he sends his regrets. We encourage you to seek out and experience Jeffrey Gibson's art in the context of this conversation. And of course, we know that this is a conversation that didn't begin today with today's panel, but goes far beyond space and time, and hopefully can help us all practice seeing a more liberated world. In that spirit, I wanted to let you all know about the new book from Cousin Collective, Temporal Territories, an anthology on Indigenous experimental cinema, which beautifully explores these topics as well. Available now. So with that, I'll welcome Rhayne and Quinne to the stage and turn it over to Adam Piron, director of the Sundance Institute Indigenous Program and co-founder of Cousin Collective, who will moderate the conversation. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out. My name, as Lauren has mentioned, my name is Adam Piron. I am from the Kiowa tribe of Oklahoma, as well as Mohawk from upstate New York in Canada. I use he, him pronouns, and as mentioned, I'm the director of the Indigenous Program at Sundance. I'm also one of the, I'm on the programming team as well, too, for the festival, and a co-founder of Cousin. Cousin, we are a film collective that was founded in 2018 at the Flaherty Film Seminar with both myself as one of the co-founders, Sky Hupinka, Alexandra Lazarowicz, and Adam Khalil. And we do a number of different things. We give out grants. We do screenings of some of this work, and our goal is essentially to get it seen, shared, and talked about, and celebrated as well too. We've had a number of films that have played at the Berlinale, the New York Film Festival, the Whitney Biennial, and a number of other places too that I'm sure some of you might be aware of. But with that, I would like to. I know we'll be playing some clips really quick after each of the intros that I do, but or I'll let them introduce themselves and then we'll play a clip. But First off, I would love to introduce Quinne Larsen.
Hello, my name's Quinne. I use they, them pronouns. I'm Chinook. I'm always describing myself as cartoons people. I make comics and animation. And thank you for having me.
Yeah, I think we'll go into, you'll get to see Quinne's film that's playing here at the festival. So yeah, let's roll.
Kagwan ka mamaya ka masamanaj. Yamit ka pa ka 23rd Street. Wik sa yaya ka haas. Kik balik ka bahaya shoyche. Alde zakhia wa ka nanaj. Alde hele misle. Wik lili haya shpaya jago. Kagwa ka kamlik spesya ka nanaj ka pa. Was hayu ko kano ich polakli kagwa ka masanaj. Gwant kagwa. Wik ka kamlik spesya ka kagwa. Wik ka naika. Naika kamdax kagwa naika damdam. Seems obvious to me, but then again, it's with kagwa. Maybe not. Anyway, Kagwa naika mas manage. Hili twach misle. Koliskia. Alle kan we call hij maatjes. Just gelu de hersk oskin. Die wacht dan is pipa. Ik kan we call ook. Kom such it, you know. It's on my step somehow, but we can come next specific go. All that let's come get sit. Kom such pipa ka oskin. All that let's come al kan we. All that kan we act to kwan, you know. All of a sudden everything's just okay. We can come next specific to go, but that's how it is. Maybe it'll be obvious to you. Anyway, we continue to come soon and go to Soon as Hulk can on a cabo. Was naked Jack Gumducks that I was already in my 20s. Be ones until let's go wow, clunch all the good was Jack Gumducks la, you know, like to make it stick after a certain age. Jet ayak, la long Jacopoli, but slim as Gumducks. Call son, gone away to Jacopoli. Just a matter of when, right? Anyway, call son, I looked at God when I was manage. All the night, Miss Capopoli. I dread say, how you tie a middle. All the Sachlia one I can manage. Clinistic to Yakumiddle. All the clinistic to Yakubawa. Because we act out Yakubawa, like a gumducks. Was it Gabo, Yakubawa? Gabo Nike gumducks. Just like a Hayu gumducks, all the Inseka gumducks, Wigna. Dread, no Wicca. All the Yakubawa, the top. Got away to Jacopoli. Just a matter of when, right?
I'd like to next introduce a good friend, also a cousin artist as well too, and our current Merita Mitzvah Fellow that we just announced yesterday, Rhayne Vermette.
Yeah, thanks, Adam. Hi, all. Yeah, I'm Rhayne. I'm from Manitoba. I'm Métis. My dad's family is from St. Anne. In 2021, I released a film called St. Anne, and it features my dad, my cousins, my godfather, my brother. A lot of my family are like quote-unquote actors in the film. I started making film as an animator, and I like to bounce back and forth between different forms of cinema. And yeah, I think my clip is one of my first films. It's called Black Rectangle. It's a very short animation. Careful with your eyes. It's a bit flickery if it bothers you. Yeah.
Cool. kind of with all that, I'd be curious to hear from both of you sort of your path to working with moving images. I think, I'd love to hear from Quinne and then, Rhayne.
I mean, I definitely started out in comics and sort of ended up in animation because it is an adjacent skill set. But it's definitely like really different being in a space like this versus like I've always been in these sort of like more industry commercial animation spaces. Like I used to work at Cartoon Network and all those things, and it's like I don't know. I'm just watching your film and I'm like, man, you guys are like smart. I'm like, I come from Dum Dum Cartoons.
What? No. As if.
Yeah, so I've just always drawn. So animation is sort of a natural outgrowth of doing that, and then writing, and now kind of trying to do a little bit more of this like stuff that doesn't necessarily have like broad appeal.
Yeah. We'll get into that in a second, but.
I kind of just fell into making movies. I was like puttering about in post-secondary a lot, and I think there was this sort of interest in filmmaking and the fascination of like how an image gets put into a film. Like this was like early 2000s, and but I just kept dropping out of like this intro course, and then I took this other intro course of filmmaking, and I made this like weird movie with my parents, and there was no dialogue, and I was told it wasn't a real film because there was no dialogue. So I just was like, oh, I guess I'm not. But then, again, puttering about post-secondary, trying to find my way for years, I ended up somehow in the School of Architecture. And yeah, it was there that I kind of was really confronted, like, wow, I'm a human being in these material spaces and these boxes we called buildings, and got really interested in trying to like defy things like that were weighing me down, like the material building, codes, and really was wanting to like move between the walls and get between the walls. And that's how, unbeknownst to me, I started animating and just like photographing my way through these simple paper models. Ended up dropping out of school, and I was like, I just want to animate and make movies, and then went to a film co-op, and then everything just kind of dominoes. Yeah.
It's very familiar being told that like the films that you want to make and that you make naturally are like not real films.
Yeah, it's funny.
I went to animation school, and like the stuff I wanted to make was stuff like this.
Yeah.
And they were like, don't do that.
Nobody likes that.
Don't do that.
Well, I think that goes to another thing as well too, because I think that there's a lot of pressure for Indigenous artists, particularly working within the moving image or film or animation as well too, to make work that does have a quote unquote broad appeal. And not that there's anything wrong with that type of work or people working in those spaces. We need that, but I think also I'm always curious. I wouldn't say I'm curious because I know what it means, but when they say if it goes for a broad appeal, and it's like, well, who is that for? Yeah. What's the issue with an Indigenous artist making work on their own terms and conditions for their own people, even if that is 5 people in their community that, are architects or, have a certain love for comics? Like, how is there any less value in that? And I think also too, just the idea that like, to me, it's just as valid to have people making that work, and also to be sort of pushing these boundaries of what is expected. Because I think it makes it easier for other folks coming after us as well too, to know that there are options to move in those spaces and stuff. But I mean, I think, Quinne, even with what you're saying, like, I think your film is a beautiful example of that too, where it is very much you. I know like some of your own passion for, for language and things like that, and how this film integrates both, I think, really beautifully the your own style of just art with a lot of these concerns that you're navigating and stuff. And I don't know how that's been for you. I mean, is that something where, as you were sort of mentioning, is this something that you're sort of like moving into outside of sort of the work that you've been doing for things like Cartoon Network and things like that? Or is this something that you're kind of like coming back to, if that makes sense?
I mean, it's stuff that I wouldn't have been comfortable working on in a studio setting, because there's just not the degree of trust I would need. Like, I don't know, like when I've done like development work with like studios, you spend a lot of time like sort of defending and explaining what you're trying to do, even when you're not including something really sensitive like language, which is so like, especially when you're doing like work in a language that is currently like, we're working on revitalizing it. We don't have that many speakers. There's more than we've ever had before, but it's squishy. So it's like, you kind of can't be in these like big commercial studio spaces and doing this kind of work just because there isn't enough understanding and there isn't enough protection for it. And it's delicate. So it's nice to be able to, like, you know, spaces like this are important and really special. I'm really grateful because I am sort of new to making work in language, and even then I like feel a little cagey about it sometimes. Yeah, this is very like sensitive, not only on a personal level, but also like for the community. So we try to be really careful. I don't know. Did that answer the question?
Yeah, no, it
Away
does.
from
And I think, and I also like, you know, I mean, curious too with you, Rhayne, as well. Like, I mean, I know we didn't show clips of St. Anne, but I think that's also like a testament to Indigenous artists trusting their own instincts and making a film as personal as they want to, and involving their community and making it for their community. I was wondering if you could talk about that a little bit. And
For sure.
Yeah.
I think, yeah, St. Anne came out of, you know, years of sort of exercising my, you know, this instrument of filmmaking. Like, I think when I came into filmmaking, there was no sense of like, I didn't feel the sense of like I had to like prove who I was or anything. And even like, again, this is like, you know, 2010, and like the quote unquote identity politics were sort of just brimming. And so within the sector and the film co-op, I really like, to me, you know, Métis was my dad, his brothers, the jokes, the drama, you know, seeing my uncle perform, like, and it wasn't this thing that I felt like I had to put it out there. Like, it was just this embodied thing. And so I just, you know, was at the film co-op, and a lot of people were like, oh, like you should put that you're Métis in your bios and then your films will get played. And I just didn't feel like, I was just like more interested in like, what do I like, how do I exercise myself in filmmaking, and like how do I manipulate this film, and was just like really leaning on these natural kind of impulses of like tearing prints apart and reassembling them, which I think within, again, early 2000, like 2010, you know, the box of Indigenous cinema was like incredibly narrow. I still think it's quite narrow, but it was like very narrow. And I sort of was like, I'm just outside of this. Like, there was a Indigenous filmmakers collective in Winnipeg, and I was like very much like friends with all of the people, but I really didn't feel like Indigenous within like the film sector. And then I was part of Indigenous documentary film program and walked into there, and it was like, I was like, we're all the Native people. Like, it was all like non-Native people telling us how to make our stories. And they really wanted, you know, us to like go for the heart and go for the tears. And I was like, well, I'm not interested in that. That's not my family. And so St. Anne kind of really came out of thinking about like, yeah, how does my dad, like, how would a character like my dad be in a film? Like, how do my connections to Manitoba, how can I express that in a film? And also really questioning, again, within this like Indigenous documentary incubator, it was like, yeah, you got to hire this like white DOP, and you have to like have a hierarchy, and you pay this person the most, and you really need this like production house, and this is how you make your film. And I was like, that doesn't seem like, you know, the type of filmmaking. It seems very oppressive. So St. Anne really was a process also of like poking at these sort of industrial pillars that, you know, you're told you need. And so, for instance, we had 5 cinematographers. Lindsay McIntyre, who's in the audience, was one of them. All women, primarily worked with Indigenous women. There was no hierarchy, all non-actors like my family. So we kind of really just, yeah, kick the shit out of, you know, these things that I was, you know, I felt like I had to like perform both in the production and both in sort of the way that I was expressing myself. And yeah, and so St. Anne came out of like all these funny questions that I had, and was a process of like figuring all that stuff out. But even like, you know, my natural impulse of like cutting film apart and like assembling it, I wasn't like trying to like make some identity thing, but like looking back on it, you know, you consider something like beading or birch bark biting. Like I spend time with like these beading circle, like young adults in like beading circles up north in Manitoba, and they're like, dude, you're totally fucking beading with film, you know? And it's like, yeah, I am. Like you guys recognize that, but even like it's funny how like my experimental work, like Saint Anne was my big like indigenous like coming out, but then it's like these works, you know, the technology, the innovation, and even like the destruction of the pillars of experimental cinema, you know, and like my carelessness for it, like that is 100% when you think of the Métis Nation, it's like 100% like Métis innovation, you know.
I guess just to like build on that, like just thinking about like the structure of these things, like, you know, animation is very rigidly like structured in how you're supposed to tell a story, or like 3-act structure is very rigidly enforced. There is a correct way. Like everybody will talk to you about like Save the Cat or the stupid story circle or whatever. But like Chinook stories.
Also,
if you
just
look
to add to that, cats are
yeah.
actually not indigenous to the Americas, so we don't have to save the
we don't have
cats.
to say that. Like, Chinook stories are all always in 5s, which like to like, you know, kind of a Western view, it feels like overlong and tedious, or like often they'll have this meandering quality. So just like having the freedom to just like, you know, make a story that is like, that makes sense to you in a different sensibility. It's like, that's huge.
Yeah.
I think also kind of adding to that, I know Katie Arthur's coordinator for the Indigenous Program, incredible, is in the crowd. She always hears me using this example a lot too, but I always say from an Indigenous standpoint, I think similar to what you were saying, Rhayne, and same with Quinne, is this idea of, again, to not knocking this idea of like more mainstream filmmaking, but this idea that that is like the pinnacle, or like once you've done that,
It must
that's the
be
thing.
this,
It
yeah.
must be that. Where I was like, it seems like such a bizarre standard, because if we actually are approaching film as an art, like no one would tell like a basket maker or like a weaver or something, well, like we made it into the Smithsonian. Like that's, you know, it like that's not, that standard is not held to any other art.
Or even novels, you know,
Exactly,
it's like, it's,
yeah.
you know, a story is a story. Like,
Yeah.
I'm like, it's a sequence of events, and you don't really need any more than that. Like,
Exactly. And I think it's like, you know, going to the title of this panel around narrative sovereignty, it's really this, I think, this idea of like, how do we, you know, we are living in a world that is, you know, the way we have to move around it, it's largely non-Indigenous controlled world and stuff. And that's just the reality of it. And we have to move through these systems in some ways, but also we can move beyond that. And I think that that is like a radical act that I think both of you are doing. But I mean, I think also thinking of that as well too, if, you know, even I think with, you know, with what Rhayne was saying, there's this idea of like, what is sort of a canon of Indigenous cinema, and it, you know, it can be a very narrow kind of thing, but also like, what does that look like when we, as Indigenous people, are sort of blowing up what that box can be and expanding that and making the stage as wide as it can possibly be. But yeah, I'd be curious to know sort of a little bit, you know, obviously about like both of your practices, and it, I mean, not that it needs to integrate that sort of thought in it or anything, but like how are you sort of like quote unquote indigenizing your work or whatever that, because I think also that, again, there is no sort of like one way of doing that. It's a very personal thing. Everybody has their own interpretation of their own indigeneity and what that can mean. And I'm just curious how much of that is there like a push and pull in terms of sort of like pushing yourself to find new ways to tell stories? Is it, do you find yourself, you know, whether it's been working in the animation industry, something where like sometimes you end up going a little bit more this way, but you're like, well, what would it be like to go this way or something? Yeah.
I mean, I think like as far as like film or like working in animation stuff goes, it's like you kind of just compartmentalize, right? Like it's like I can work in this mode where it's like, all right, this is how an 11-minute episode works, and then it's nice to be able to like switch that off and make something like this. So hopefully being able to do more of that. And then, you know, I make comics as well, so trying to, I don't know, I like lean into this sort of meandering quality that I really like in a lot of those stories that like are traditional stories, but also just the stuff that we listen to that are like elder recordings or like just the way people talk. There's this like wandering quality that I really like. So I've been trying to kind of lean into that and also find places to like include language in a way that feels comfortable, but also like fun. Like I feel like fun doesn't get talked about a lot. So like, I don't know, like there's if you look at like our like older recordings and stuff, like sometimes people like use like a Chinook way to do like the sound of a crackling fire or something. So like trying to put more of those like kinds of sound effects in my like comics. I feel like that's really silly, but like
No, it's
but I'm
awesome,
like,
yeah,
I would
yeah.
use those pronunciations. Like, why do I have to put crackle? Like, when it could be like, yeah. I love that. Yeah, how about you?
I think for me, yeah, it's like just my connection to creation and the creative universe. Like I'm kind of no holds barred, and I'm a little like selfish about it, and I just sort of, again, like do what naturally happens. Like this, the idea to start cutting up film prints. Like I don't know where that came from, but I just like got obsessed with it. I don't ever think of like audience. I don't ever think of who's this for, to be honest. It's more just like I have these questions about myself, or I want to see something. I get really obsessed with images and wanting to see things. I want to see beautiful things, and I kind of chase them. And I've been so blessed that like it's kind of been like a dominoes, and things have led one thing to another. And like it's just, I'm not like actively being like I need to like indigenize this. I never thought, it was never this act. It was like I just want to like put myself out there and make what I want to see, and make what I'm comfortable with, and make things that kind of expand my world. But especially now with like Saint Anne and the feature films, like part of it was like recognizing that I could be a channel of wealth. And when I think of wealth, I obviously think of money, but I think of relationships, experiences, skill building, all this kind of stuff. And so I think like a big focus, especially with, because like these animations, it's just me by myself with tape and the cat and just like listening to music and putting them together. But with the feature films, it's like, wow, I could actually like instill some sort of change and like be sort of like this funnel of wealth to the people I love, who's like my family, my community, my friends, and kind of start changing the players in the game in Manitoba, who are like, generally white cis guys and union guys who, have like been in the union for like decades, and they're just the guy. Like they think there's like, two DOPs who mostly shoot everything in Winnipeg, and so a lot of Saint Anne was just like taking, people who've like never worked with an RES R3 and being like, hey, this is like the button you hit and like go, it's how you find the focus. So I think sort of what I am consciously doing is like thinking about community and just, thinking about channeling what I can, and like being just generous with like whatever I have, just giving it, trying to give it back, and just like grow and inspire people. But generally for as far as like the stories and like how things are, the ideas, it really is just like a natural, I'm just following natural impulses, and I'm not really thinking beyond that, to be honest. Like Saint Anne, I really thought Saint Anne would just kind of disappear, and then one day I'd make a really incredible feature film, and people would then be like, oh wow, and this first film, like I never expected any of anything that's happened to me. It was never, I've never chased it. It's just kind of been these nice surprises along the way that I'm very grateful for. Yeah.
Also, one thing I was also going to add, Rhayne was also the DP on Dead Lover that just premiered here at the festival as well too. So, yeah. No, I think there's also something, I think, kind of around that idea though too. I think both, with Rhayne and Quinne, as you as well. But I mean, I think it's also really thinking about community in terms of filmmaking, whether it's the audience of like, if this is for Chinook speakers, or even like a super small subsect of Chinook speakers that like love comic books or animation, you know what I mean? But, or even just like your family and stuff. And I think that's I think a really radical way to rethink of how we're making work. Because again, too, I do think it pushes against this idea of sort of almost compartmentalizing and sort of like decentralizing an Indigenous audience, which again, too, I don't know why anybody else. And another example I always bring up is sort of, it's like, it'd be like if you went to like Iran or like Japan and told like Ozu or like Kiarostami, like, well, you should really be thinking about American audiences. Like, like I think if we are really looking at this idea of sovereignty and ourselves as being from these separate nations that have a whole history of like defining what that is, and us being a part of that, like, why would we do something like that? So, but yeah, I mean, I'm curious to know kind of your thoughts with that. I mean, I know like Rhayne, you were saying, which I think also too, I mean, that is I think a fair proposition as well too. It's like if you're making films kind of for yourself first and foremost, and then your community after, I mean, that's also one way to make films, and it's not a wrong way to do it. So clearly.
Yeah, because I'm like, I'm part of it. I'm a human being. Like that's always just like, if I'm interested, then I trust that other people would be interested. And even with St. Anne, like I wasn't, I was just, there was these things like, the old truck, which I wanted there because it was reminding me of my dad. And there was all these things that I wanted in there, but it was never like, I need to put these things in to kind of like put the label of like Métis on. But then it's just, they're in there, like, and then showing it to especially Métis audiences who are like, oh yeah, the horror of those trains. And, they like pick up on these things. And it's like, yeah, it's like, if you get it, you get it. I'm also not here to like explain things. I also find that that's so inauthentic, and I really want to just do something that's authentic. And I think it's so easy to perform something, and I'm interested in the murkiness and the layers and the nuance. Like nuance is a huge thing that I'm like really into and thinking through. So, because I think that just also advances the way that we are identifying ourselves within our nations. If we are kind of moving away from these sort of tropes, because it was like with St. Anne, I was like, oh, fiddle music. It's like, no, I'm gonna hire my friend Brett, who's gonna do all these creepy tape loops and and just we're gonna mess it up. Like I'm like, because that's not me. Like I don't really care for fiddle music. Like so I think that's kind of how I just trust that like if I'm into it, other people, like-minded people will be into it. Yeah.
Definitely. Like I feel like I really resonate with that.
Yeah.
Like it's just like not having to explain yourself, and like again trusting that like the kinds of things that you're putting in will find who they're for. Like I think a lot about like we talk about having like our own sense of cultural fluency and being able to like trust and rely on that stuff. So like that includes like imagery from like our stories that like I like and it means something to me, but I'll put in and not comment on, and like other Chinook people notice it, but it's not really like it just looks like Indian stuff to a lot of people, and that's fine. Like that's okay.
Totally.
Yeah, it's like nice to be able to like lean into just what you think is interesting, like what you think is fun, and not have to like cater it to like this expected idea.
Yeah, I think that's also something I always try to advocate for as well too. I think especially with Indigenous artists and stuff is the idea of pushing against trying to contextualize yourself, because it's already like, I mean, we're already on our own land. Why do we have to say why we're here for other people? Why do we have to explain what we're doing? It's like everyone else should get on our level, in my opinion. But I also think too, I mean, I think it's a really powerful thing, I think, with both of you guys. And I know I brought it up yesterday at the Native Forum event, but yeah, obviously I've been thinking about David Lynch a lot recently. I mean, his work means a lot to me. Also, I think somebody who, a non-Indigenous artist who kind of got on our level on a lot of different ways too. But I think really sort of this idea of like trusting your own instincts and not trying to do that. And I just think, I don't know. I think you guys are two prime examples of, just doing that and leaning into that. And which I think is, again, it's like this sort of work hasn't been seen because it hasn't been made before, and I think that that's a really powerful thing. And I think you guys are sort of, forging a path forward for people, whether they choose to follow you or whether they're like, oh yeah, I like what they did, but I want to go this way instead, which I think is also really rad. So, yeah. But I think kind of with that though, I'll open it up. We got some time for some questions and stuff. Anyone? Yeah.
Thank you so much. I'm just curious, based on some of the dialogue that we've been, hearing you all have, how important is it for your work to be seen as Indigenous? Like, to what extent does that, matter to you at all? So if it is important, why? And then what is the awareness of the fact that the work is Indigenous? What do you hope that awareness brings about or means for people, or the impact that has?
That's a big question. I mean, I feel like, when I think about like, especially like Indigenous people in the animation industry, there's just not a lot of us. So I feel like I do want to be visible as an Indigenous person in that space. just because it's even like, I have friends who are Native and they've been, directors in animation for a long time, but they're not comfortable talking about being Native because it just there isn't a lot of space for it. So I guess it is important to me to feel like my work is seen specifically as Indigenous. Just to be like, well, this film is Indigenous work, but also like every episode of We Bear Bears I made is like, it's also, that's an Indigenous person worked on that, and that counts as Indigenous work. So that's, you want people to feel like whatever kind of work they're making is valid. They're allowed to not perform it in a way that, can feel prescribed. Like if you never make something in your language, or you never make anything that, feels like you're specifically speaking to an idea of like a traditional culture or something, like that's okay. Like just, being present and having that different kind of background, the perspective that you're bringing to it is also, that counts. I don't know if that's a good answer.
It's a great answer. Yeah, I don't know. I get these funny, because again, I started making these formalist animations, and was like, it was like kind of outside of this box, and it was like, I find too, experimental cinema, like the limits of experimental cinema, also keeps Indigenous audiences out of like appreciating what it is. So I find like I'm always in this like gray area, like it's like experimental and Indigenous, and I'm always like, I feel like I have nothing to prove. Like I'm confident in myself and the way I make things. But for sure there is a part of me that would like to have the audiences come together and like not have this like funny segregation. And I think it is starting to happen. Like the more that because I used to also never travel with my work. And so a lot of the conversation and language surrounding my first films was like, like male programmers, like assigning a language to them. And so I'm kind of, now that I have the opportunity to travel, I'm trying to like unravel the language of like these first films and kind of broaden sort of even the conversation of experimental cinema, because people see what I'm doing and they can only just say like, oh, that's Stan Brakhage. And even like, I think Stan Brakhage is basic. Like I don't really like Stan Brakhage, I don't care for a lot of experimental cinema, like, because the canon was very much weaponized against me also when I first started making film. And so I think that's part of why I started cutting up prints and making new things out of them. And so, I think there's limits of language that are kind of really oppressing sort of form. But for me personally, like I think everything's coming from me. So I'm Métis, it's Métis, and like the logic and the process. And if you really kind of study the nation and sort of what happened in Manitoba, and even like collaborators coming on and how I'm treating my collaborators and how I'm dealing with the money and making all these conversations, like it is all part of like this cosmology that is hyper Métis. But again, it's hyper nuanced. And I don't really feel like I have to prove it, because it's like the people back home they know who I am, they know how I work. They appreciate it. But for sure, like, I think it is important to like pay attention to the films, because I think, there is sort of this like industrial assimilation of like new voices into like, this is sort of how you should make a film and how you should posit a Native character in a film. And so, I really like to share my work with Indigenous audience, because sometimes people are like, oh, it never occurred to me to like make a film this way or tell a story this way, or so and that's like really engaging for me and gives me pleasure. So
Yeah, in the back. Yeah, I can repeat the question if it's easy to.
Thank you. I made them. Thanks so much for the conversation. My question's actually for Quinne. I really loved your film. We were able to see it Friday night. But my question, and congratulations, or I think the amount of language, like the majority of the film is in your language, and as a fellow language learner, like I can't imagine how much work and how many hours went into being able to do that whole film in your language. And my question is about translation, like how you were working with that. And I also thought it was really powerful that you also have a few English phrases in there as well. And I think it kind of works against this idea of like purity, that it all needs to be in the language. Yeah, so yeah, I'm just wondering if you could talk more about that and just generally how you kind of translated your ideas and this dream, you know, into your language and what kind of issues came up around that.
I'm so glad that you said that. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, one of the main things I really wanted to do with this film was just sort of reflect how we talk to each other in the language, which is like, you'll talk for a while in Chinook and then you run into something where it's like, it's too much work and you just say it in English. Yeah. Like, it's like, or it's just like, there's not a good translation for it. I'm very much like a loose translation kind of guy. Like I get frustrated sometimes talking to like, I don't know, like a couple of my friends are like linguists and they'll like want it like very specifically, like exactly. And I'm like, well, as long as you understood the gist of it, it's like, that's language, right? Like as long as we understand each other, it works. Yeah, there's a bunch of stuff where it's like the spirit of the sentence is translated, but maybe not like word for word. And that's something that we talk about too. Like, I don't know, like when you are writing stuff in your, like in language, it is nice to get, you know, to a place where it's like fine if it's imperfect. And the stuff that comes out is different when you're writing it in language first versus writing it in English and then trying to translate it, which often like doesn't work just because the like mechanics of the language can be so different. Like everything with Chinakwawa is so blunt. It's like such a blunt language, and that's like the character of it. Like you wouldn't tell somebody like in a florid way that they're very beautiful. It's like, you're good to look at. Like that's it. Like it's so like that's very much the character of the language, and the way that it comes out when you're writing it that way first is. Like that was something that I really wanted to do in this film, and just sort of see like how is the character of it different if I start from that place, and then where there's something I don't know how to say, I can just switch into English and that's okay. Like same way that we talk to each other. Yeah, just making space for imperfect speaking, flawed speaking, or a mixed way of speaking, which I think we all do naturally. And Chinook is a Creole beyond that, so you know there's a lot of French and English already folded into it. So to switch into like an entire sentence of English is fine. We're just like, it's Chinooklish, it's fine.
Any other questions? Anyone? Okay. I think with that, we'll wrap it up, but yeah, you can come talk to us afterwards if you want. So, but yeah, thank you again so much to the MacArthur Foundation. Thank you to Lauren. Thank you so much for coming to this and yeah, just letting us talk about work and stuff. So, yeah.